History is funny. Sometimes two events or moments that seem completely unconnected can, in a strange way, actually have a common thread. The weird connection story that I think truly shows how interesting history can be is the link between bird poop and nuclear bombs. I know it sounds crazy, but in a very stupid kind of way, they have a shared history. Let's start with bird poop. There is some historical context to know about the importance of it in the pre-1900s era. For starters, farming is how civilizations grow and expand. Having reliable access to food is the only way a population can increase. People need to eat, so that means creating enough food for a surplus. When a civilization gets to a food surplus, then they need to manage that surplus, which leads to pottery and numbers. Now they need a way to store the urns and keep track of the math, which leads to basic engineering and writing. Then we need a way to distribute said food. That leads to roads. All this stuff needs to be managed and guarded in some central location, right? Which leads to urbanization. Basically, the plot of the game Civilization. It's a pretty accurate game and kind of fun. So, if you want to learn about how a civilization develops, play it. Everything revolves around food. However, an issue arises with population growth. In the 1800s, industrialization started, which meant large numbers of people moving from primarily living around farms, close to the food production centers, to living and working in large, sprawling cities, away from the food production regions. Those factory jobs may have vastly changed the technology available to civilizations, but they also took away a key resource from the farms: poop. Farming in the 1800s was pretty different than today. Today we have acres of staggeringly prolific fields bustling with high-yield crops. Back then, it was a pretty touch-and-go business. Arable land contains nutrients, without which plants simply cannot grow. The key nutrient is nitrogen. Soil without nitrogen yields underdeveloped plants with pale leaves and protein-poor seeds. On the lucky side, nitrogen does make up almost 4/5 of the Earth's atmosphere by volume. However, unluckily, atmospheric nitrogen is almost exclusively dinitrogen, or N2, whose strong triple bonds render it unreactive and thus inaccessible to plants. I know, this is sounding like a middle school science class, but stick with me, it gets interesting. Even worse for humanity, nature offers frustratingly few ways to turn dinitrogen into a usable reactive compound. Lightning can do it, and same with bacteria that inhabit the nodules of roots from some legumes. Whatever the fuck that means. But that's it, those are the only ways. For millennia, that didn't matter too much. Agricultural traditions found ways to manage the nitrogen flows. These were intricate ballets between farmer and earth. Nitrogen-rich manures were spread, crops rotated, forests burned, fields left fallow, or lentils planted. However, as mentioned earlier, industrialization changed the dynamic of civilization, and the complex system of nitrogen flow started to falter. Industrialization required raw materials to be sent to factories in order to create the finished products, and also grain to feed the workers. Farms used to rotate a variety of crops for local consumption, but when industrialization started, many farms focused more on the most profitable crops and grew them for distant markets. Think about the cotton industry, for example. Why waste valuable farm space to slowly plant beans when cotton is in high demand for British manufacturers? An additional side effect was that by delivering the produce of the countryside to distant cities, the new agriculture broke the established cycle that restored waste, human and animal, to the land. That is how nitrates return to the soil. Poop. Large cities were literally flushing away into rivers and oceans millions of dollars worth of nitrogen waste every year that could have been used to fertilize the farms. To put it into perspective, it is estimated that the annual value in human poop lost was roughly $50 million. That's close to the entire federal budget in the 1850s. Soil exhaustion had become a massive concern within the United States. Farmers were looking everywhere for material to spread on their fields to replenish them. City poop was too dispersed and heavy to collect and transport, and few of the replacement soil amendments lived up to expectations. What did work was white gold, or guano, or less eloquently put, bird shit. The most nitrogen-rich of bird poop was from cormorants, boobies, and pelicans, or ocean birds. The Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru were a literal gold mine of bird poop. Oceanic islands are the perfect collection areas. Seabirds love to congregate there in large numbers, and those islands rarely saw rain. The guano piled hundreds of feet high and baked in the sun all day for years, so that by the time of the Industrial Revolution, these rock slabs had centuries worth of calcified bird poop stuck to them. The drawback of guano, not shockingly,
surprise, motherfucker,
is that it smells like shit. It was said that the smell of these islands was perceptible for miles. In fact, sailors hauling it could spend no more than 15 minutes below decks before emerging gasping for breath and sometimes even suffering nosebleeds or temporary blindness. but it was revolutionary on farms, turning guano into a resource comparable to oil today. Like oil today, the more demand for said material, the more the price increases. Economics 101. The British had a tight control of the guano supply, with a monopoly on exports from Peru. The guano question became a big deal, appearing in 4 presidential annual messages, most famously by President Millard Fillmore. He stated it was the duty of the government to secure guano at a reasonable price. This striving for cheap guano is how the US almost ended up in a war over bird poop. And some say the war on terror seems crazy now.
It fooled me, we can't get fooled again.
In 1852, Millard Fillmore's Secretary of State gave speculators a blank check to go out and scrape guano off the islands close to Peru, promising naval protection and even dispatching a warship for the mission. Peru claimed sovereignty over these islands, and so naturally they saw this as an invasion and prepared for war. Cooler heads prevailed though, and the bird poop war was avoided when the United States backed down. The US found another source for their bird poop problem, in the Central Pacific on the Howland and Jarvis Islands. Both of these are thousands of miles away from the nearest large landmass. The American Guano Company put together the sum of $10 million for the expedition. For context, the US federal budget in 1850 was less than $45 million total. The company also asked for assistance from the US Navy, which President Franklin Pierce energetically gave, going so far as to back the Guano Islands Act in 1856, which basically stated that if a US citizen discovered guano on an unclaimed, uninhabited island, that island would now be considered a US territory. The first batch of islands were added to the US in 1857, and by 1863 the government had annexed 59 islands. The last guano island was claimed in 1902. By that time, the United States' bird-shit empire spanned 94 islands. These little guano islands were not exactly tropical paradises though. Pretty much the exact opposite. Guano only accumulated in extremely dry, oceanic deserts, where the lack of rainfall allowed bird poop to collect for hundreds of years. These islands were barren rocks, not fertile plains, places completely not meant for humans to exist. But someone has to do the hard work of getting the valuable white gold home. It takes a lot of work to mine, tunnel, pick, and blast this stuff loose, then haul it to the ships. It's probably one of the worst jobs imaginable. It involved all the brutal labor and lung damage from coal mining, while also being marooned on a hot, dry, shit-smelling deserted island for months at a time. Respiratory diseases causing workers to pass out or cough up blood were very common, as were gastrointestinal issues. Not surprising when you consider the crowded conditions, rotten food, and lack of fresh water. All the while, you have birds circling overhead, raining down more white gold. So who in the hell would do this job? Finding workers was difficult for guano companies. For example, Peruvian lords relied on Chinese laborers who they lured with false promises or just simply kidnapped. US speculators mainly relied on people from the Hawaiian Islands. Another source of workers was from Baltimore actually. The Navassa Phosphate Company recruited from the African American population of Baltimore, promising a life of picking fruit and romancing with beautiful women, inducing the often illiterate workers to sign up and hop aboard. However, once the workers arrived, they saw the hell that greeted them. The rough conditions did eventually lead to a revolt and a very interesting legal case. The workers who revolted were brought back to Maryland to stand trial, where their defense rested on the idea that the rioters could not be convicted because the United States lacked jurisdiction on these islands. They pointed out that Haiti too claimed the Navassa Island, and since the US lacked an official station there, it should be considered foreign soil and not a part of the United States. The Supreme Court sided with the prosecution, but it didn't end there though.
Well, I didn't want to do this. But
I'm calling Kangaroo Court on this court.
Kangaroo Court. It's a Kangaroo Court.
I'm calling Kangaroo
Call
Court.
it.
President Benjamin Harrison became interested in the case, worried that the Navassa Phosphate Company had turned part of the US into its own corporate fiefdom, not governed by law, but by corporate regulations. His investigation found that Navassa was being run as a convict establishment, though without a prison's comforts of cleanliness. Harrison then commuted the death sentences of the rioters. Let's get back on topic. If guano is so important, what happened? Why does no history really cover it? Well, everything changed in 1909, when Fritz Haber, a German Jewish chemist, developed a technique for synthesizing ammonia, which is a nitrogen compound. By 1914, this experimental technique had become industrially viable, and in that year, Haber's method, called the Haber-Bosch process, yielded as much reactive nitrogen as the entire Peruvian guano trade. The big difference was that Haber-Bosch, unlike guano mining, was infinitely expandable, and it didn't require searching the seas for birdshit islands. With that, Haber unlocked the door to unlimited population growth. Soil exhaustion ceased being a threat. Without the Haber-Bosch process, the Earth could sustain roughly 2.4 billion people. Today's population is almost 8 billion. Pretty revolutionary stuff. That invention makes Fritz Haber one of the most important scientists in history. Although, that was not his only contribution to the world. When World War I erupted, Haber volunteered his scientific mind to the German cause. He suggested that the ammonium pouring out of German fertilizer plants could be repurposed as explosives to bolster Germany's dwindling munition supplies. The start of the war and the ensuing British blockade had cut off German access to imported nitrates, and so Haber's solution was an essential contribution to the German war effort. It's estimated that Germany would have lost the war by early 1916 had Haber not replenished German stocks of nitrate explosives. Another interesting contribution to science was when Haber, as a central figure in the German scientific establishment, used his position to promote the career of a young and gifted scientist named Albert Einstein. And as many may know, Albert Einstein wrote the key letter to US leaders informing them of Nazi plans to develop a nuclear bomb, which in turn led US leaders to prioritize the development of their own nuclear bomb to counter the German threat. So in a very weird way, the story of bird poop and its importance to human growth through soil nutrition is connected to the eventual development of the nuclear bomb. Now I know what you're probably thinking. That's such a weak link, and it's not like those two have any real direct connections. You could do that with a lot of disconnected historical events. Just find random paths in time at which they crossed. However, the point of this video is not to say that bird poop caused nuclear bombs. Instead, it's to show how history has a way of flowing and moving in directions you never thought possible. One last example story. Back to the man who saved civilization, Fritz Haber. His contribution to the German war effort was not limited to nitrate explosive stocks. He also introduced war to poison gas. He not only invented it, but also personally supervised its debut in 1915 at the Battle of Ypres. In a weird irony, the man who saved the world from starvation also created the first weapon of mass destruction. And he didn't stop there. After the war, his institute developed a promising insecticide called Zyklon A. A slightly modified version called Zyklon B would eventually be used in World War II. Not on the battlefield though, instead against Fritz's fellow Jews in Hitler's gas chambers. History can sometimes have a tragic irony to it. You just never know where the river of history will flow next.